Namaskar. Amongst the works of Sanskrit literature that have exercised a decisive influence upon the formation of world civilization, a small group of texts occupies a position of singular importance. If one were to identify 6 or 7 Sanskrit works that have made an enduring contribution to the intellectual and cultural history of humanity or to world culture, the Rigveda, the Ramayana of Valmiki, the Mahabharata, Ashtadhyayi by Panini, Arthashastra by Kautilya, and Natyashastra by Bharat Muni would undoubtedly form the core of such a list. The Gītā or Srimad Bhagavad Gītā, constituting a section of the Mahabharata, has long transcended its narrative context to emerge as one of the world's greatest philosophical works in its own right. Its independent reception across civilizations has enabled the commentatorial literature that subjected it to shape the ethical, the philosophical, and the spiritual discourses that reached far beyond the boundaries of India. The modern global reception of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, particularly its remarkable intellectual impact upon Europe, began in the late 18th century. A significant turning point occurred in 1773 when Warren Hastings was appointed the first Governor General of Bengal by the East India Company. Although Hastings later became a controversial political figure and was subjected to impeachment proceedings, those controversies remain distinct from his enduring contribution to the study of Indian civilization. Hastings was perhaps unaware of the global impact of his initiatives. He was serving the colonial masters or his superiors of the East India Company. But his keen interest in Indian philosophy, in Sanskrit literature, and the intellectual traditions of India inspired several initiatives that fundamentally transformed the European understanding of Sanskrit thought, or Sanskrit culture, or Indian civilization, Indian traditions of knowledge also. Whatever political controversies may surround his legacy, his patronage of Sanskrit learning, and his encouragement of the study of Indian philosophical texts had far-reaching consequences. During his tenure as the Governor General of Bengal, Warren Hastings actively encouraged several of his associates to study Sanskrit and acquaint themselves with the philosophical traditions of India. Foremost amongst them was Charles Wilkins, who was born in 1749 and died in 1836. Charles Wilkins' pioneering contribution to Sanskrit studies profoundly shaped the reception of Indian thought in Europe. Wilkins arrived in India around 1770 as a young man of about 20 and entered the service of the East India Company as a junior clerk. His exceptional intellectual abilities soon became evident. He quickly mastered both Bengali and Persian, and his linguistic proficiency led to successive promotions until he was appointed as an official translator for the company, where translation between Persian and English constituted an indispensable administrative requirement during the early phase of British rule in Bengal. or East India Company's rule in Bengal. Wilkins' intellectual curiosity extended well beyond his official responsibilities. His practical ingenuity is reflected in the design of Bengali movable type, for which he collaborated with local blacksmiths to cast printing characters and establish a printing press capable of publishing books in Bengali script. This was a kind of printing revolution, and many Sanskrit Pandits joined the publication of books in Bengali and in Sanskrit as well later on. These remarkable achievements brought him to the attention of Warren Hastings, who recognized his scholarly potential and his talents as well, and encouraged him to undertake the study of Sanskrit. Hastings possessed a deep personal interest in Gītā and earnestly desired the preparation of a reliable English translation directly from Sanskrit original. There was no English translation of Gītā till now directly attempted from the Sanskrit original. Earlier European encounters with Sanskrit philosophical literature, particularly the Upanishads, had generally been mediated through Persian translations. Dara Shikoh, a visionary and Sufi, who was mercilessly butchered by Aurangzeb, had translated 52 Upanishads in his Sirra-e-Akbar, or spelled as Sirra-e-Akbar, Sirra al-Akbar, etc., which means the great secret or the greatest mystery. This Sirra-e-Akbar was translated from Persian into Latin by Anquetil Duperron, who was a traveler to India from France in the middle of 18th century. Subsequently, this translation by Dara as translated into Persian by Duperron, entered German intellectual circles. Numerous Sanskrit philosophical works had thus reached Europe only through Persian intermediaries. Hastings sought to change the situation by cultivating English scholars capable of studying Sanskrit directly and translating its text from the original language. With this objective, he sent Charles Wilkins to Kashi or Banaras to undertake advanced Sanskrit studies with particular emphasis upon Gītā, upon Srimad Bhagavad Gītā. Under the guidance of the distinguished scholar Kashinath Bhattacharya, Wilkins acquired a thorough knowledge of Sanskrit and developed himself to the study of Srimad Bhagavad Gītā. These years marked the beginning of a new phase in European engagement with Indian intellectual traditions, founded upon direct access to Sanskrit sources rather than intermediary translations. The same intellectual milieu also witnessed the arrival of Sir William Jones in Kolkata. Born in 1746, Jones assumed office as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Calcutta in 1778. Together with Charles Wilkins, he would become one of the foremost pioneers in introducing Sanskrit literature and Indian philosophy to the Western scholarly world. Together, Sir William Jones and Charles Wilkins laid the foundations of the translations of Sanskrit literature into English. Even before Wilkins' translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gītā, Warren Hastings had initiated two other very significant initiatives of scholarly enterprise. One of them was a preparation of a comprehensive compendium of Sanskrit Dharmashastra text which was compiled by 50 Sanskrit Pandits under the title Vivadarnav Setu. It was first translated into Persian and then subsequently from Persian retranslated into English. This compilation was the first authentic book to be used in British law courts. The efflorescence was breathing with a kind of potential now. Charles Wilkins acquired sufficient command over Sanskrit language to complete the first direct English translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita from the Sanskrit original in 1785. This publication marked a watershed in European reception of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, opening an entirely new avenue for its study and laying the foundation of its subsequent dissemination throughout the Western intellectual world. The publication of Gita was by no means straightforward. Wilkins had to persuade, or Hastings, better to say, had to persuade the board of directors of the East India Company to permit its publication, to permit the printing of Srimad Bhagavad Gita under the aegis of the East India Company. Because the company was generally reluctant to sponsor or publish Sanskrit texts. The significance of such approval, which was sought and finally obtained, may be appreciated by recalling the later struggles of Max Muller, who encountered considerable difficulties in securing official support for the publication of Rig Veda, almost 100 years after this. Against this backdrop, the appearance of Wilkins' translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita constituted an important intellectual event. To felicitate this publication, Warren Hastings addressed a lengthy letter addressed to Nathaniel Smith, Squire, whom he addresses as the quote, first member of the first commercial body, quote unquote, meaning the first commercial body means the East India Company. This letter is written from Banaras, which is spelled as Banaris, Banaris. On the 4th October 1784, it is drafted or dispatched. This letter subsequently would be included as the preface to the first ever English translation from the original of Srimad Bhagavad Gita by Charles Wilkins. In his attempt to convince his superiors of the importance of publishing the first ever English translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gita directly from the Sanskrit original, Hastings makes a determined case for its significance. He takes stock of the difficulties that a European reader might encounter in fully appreciating Srimad Bhagavad Gita. The text, he observes, reflects a moral and social order with which Europeans had long remained unfamiliar. He also acknowledges that it contains obscure passages that may appear absurd, reflect barbaric customs, or seem to embody a distorted morality. He concedes that some passages may appear redundant and that many are adorned with elaborate poetic embellishments ill-suited to European taste. Such passages, he admits, might even offend readers belonging to a different religious tradition or moral sensibilities. At the same time, however, Hastings recognizes how deeply the teachings of Srimad Bhagavad Gita are rooted in the cultural milieu of India. He expresses admiration for the priests of Banaras, whose lives, in his view, were transformed through Gita and whose lives embodied the philosophy of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Praising Wilkins' translation, Hastings draws the reader's attention to the emphasis of action in Srimad Bhagavad Gītā, its application and its practical dimensions. Action, application, and practical dimensions. These are the words used by Charles Wilkins in his translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gītā. Hastings implies the expression abstracted contemplation, quote unquote, to describe the spiritual discipline advocated by Srimad Bhagavad Gītā, and concludes that it's a work of remarkable originality. These are his words. It's a work of remarkable originality, sublimity of conception, and excellence of reasoning, almost unequal in the philosophical literature of world. Hastings further argues that the publication of Charles Wilkins' translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gītā would mitigate the burdens of colonial rule and would be remembered as an act of benevolence and obligation. He even goes so far as to declare, I'm quoting from Warren Hastings, and Warren Hastings later addressed to the board of directors of the East India Company. These are instances from the text like it and the Mahabharata, which will survive when the British dominion in India shall have long ceased to exist, and when the sources which it once yielded of wealth and power are lost to remembrance. These are very significant words from Warren Hastings, almost declaring that someday the sun of British rule in India will set, but the text Srimad Bhagavad Gītā and passages from Mahabharata will last forever. This letter was subsequently printed as a 12-page preface to Wilkins' edition or translation of Srimad Bhagavad Gītā. In his own dedication, Wilkins expresses profound gratitude to Hastings, acknowledging the encouragement he had received to study Sanskrit and attributing the transformation of his intellectual life to his engagement with Srimad Bhagavad Gītā and to the labor of translating it into English. All this is due to Hastings, he says. Hastings in turn praises the diligence with which Wilkins had undertaken the translation, emphasizing the immense effort required to render such a philosophically sophisticated text into English. The history of the English translations of the Mahabharata remains an important yet insufficiently explored field, Hastings says, and he lays an emphasis upon further producing translation of Mahabharata also. And he says that Wilkins had already started translating the Mahabharata also. Ultimately, Hastings believed that Srimad Bhagavad Gītā established the principle of unity of the divine while simultaneously rejecting excessive ritualism. It was this understanding that led him to regard the text as one of exceptional philosophical and religious importance. Charles Wilkins' introductory essay on Srimad Bhagavad Gītā is equally revealing. He interpreted the text as an exposition of Advaitavada. Monotheism is the word he uses. Reading Srimad Bhagavad Gītā through the conceptual framework familiar to an 18th century Christian intellectual, he argued that it ultimately affirmed a form of monotheism over polytheistic worship, conceiving the Supreme Being as the universal spirit. His admiration for the text is evident throughout this preface. He cited several verses from Srimad Bhagavad Gita to illustrate the depth of philosophical insights and the ethical principles it expounds. He also acknowledged that his own intellectual outlook had been transformed through his study of Srimad Bhagavad Gita and candidly admitted that many of the teachings of Srimad Bhagavad Gita had become an integral part of his personal worldview. Wilkins writes in his preface, and I am quoting him, "It seems as if the principal design of these dialogues was to unite all the prevailing modes of worship in those days, and by setting up the doctrine of the unity of the Godhead in opposition to the idolatrous sacrifices and the worship of images to undermine the tenets inculcated by the Vedas. For although the author dared not to make a direct attack upon the Vedas, he means either upon the prevailing prejudices of the people or the divine authority of those ancient books, meaning the Vedas, yet by offering eternal happiness to such who worship Brahman, the Almighty, whilst he declares the reward of such who follow other gods shall be but a temporary enjoyment of an inferior heaven." He is hinting upon the stanza from Srimad Bhagavad Gita, "Tetam bhuktva sargalokam vishalam, kshine punye marti lokam vishanti." So the abode in heaven is temporary for the persons of punya or merit. It is for a period measured by the extent of their virtues. This design was to bring about the downfall of polytheism, Hastings says, or at least Wilkins says, or at least to induce men to believe that God is present everywhere, quote unquote. Wilkins's translation remains readily accessible today. First published from Kolkata in 1785 under the auspices of the Asiatic Society also, it was republished in London the following year and subsequently appeared in several later editions. Even today, it remains remarkably careful and conscientious attempt to understand and convey the meaning of the Sanskrit original to an English reader or to an European reader. Although one may disagree with many of the interpretive choices of Wilkins, Wilkins himself candidly acknowledged the limitations of the translation. He believed that certain Sanskrit terms had no satisfactory English equivalents, and therefore he deliberately left them untranslated. One such example is Varna Sankara, which appears in the very first chapters of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna expresses his fear that the mass destruction of the warrior class would lead to a social disorder through Varna Sankara. Finding no precise English equivalent, like mixing of caste, etc., Wilkins retained the original Sanskrit expression. He adopted a similar approach to several other technical terms from Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Words such as Muni, Rishi, Veda, although the spellings in English of 18th century are a bit different. Veda is spelled as Vida or V-E-I-D, something like that. So Rishi, Muni, Veda were likewise left untranslated. The decision was entirely justified. Decision of Charles Wilkins. For these terms belong to a specific culture and philosophical tradition whose meanings cannot be adequately conveyed through equivalents drawn from a different linguistic and cultural context. By contrast, Wilkins rendered Atman or Atma as spirit, a choice that has since generated considerable scholarly discussion. The term spirit might have been replaced by soul, or better, right, Atman itself, although even that would not fully capture the philosophical richness of Atman if soul is used, if the word soul is used. The most satisfactory solution, therefore, is to retain the Sanskrit term Atman itself. Wilkins also raised certain interpretative questions in his introductory observations. For example, he noted that Srimad Bhagavad Gita refers to three Vedas, whereas the traditional account maintains that Brahma revealed four Vedas from his four mouths. Nevertheless, Wilkins's translation reached Europe and profoundly influenced its intellectual climate. An equally significant role was played by Warren Hastings's extensive prefatory essay in which he described Srimad Bhagavad Gita as a work of extraordinary originality, distinguished by the excellence of its reasoning and by its unparalleled contribution to humanity. Hastings went so far as to suggest that apart from Christianity, Srimad Bhagavad Gita could stand comparison with and perhaps even surpass the sacred text of every other known religion. For Hastings, therefore, Srimad Bhagavad Gita was a work of immense philosophical and religious value, a judgment he expressed unequivocally in his preface. Once Charles Wilkins's translation, together with Hastings's substantial introduction, reached Europe, it began to attract the attention of some of the continent's foremost intellectuals. With this, I conclude this discussion and I will come back for further discussions on Srimad Bhagavad Gita in modern world. Thank you very much.